3 days. That's how long your grocery store lasts if diesel trucks stop moving today. You probably think the government has a backup plan. It doesn't. Officials already drained 172 million barrels from the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve in early 2026. It's now at its lowest level since 1983, and they're refilling it at a fraction of the speed they emptied it. America's emergency oil cushion is thinner than it's been in over 4 decades. And while you're just one disruption away from empty shelves, the biggest oil companies in the world are cashing out. Imagine stepping inside a grocery store in the middle of one of the biggest and busiest cities on the planet, only to find empty shelves. No bread, no milk, no fruit. Now imagine that same scenario playing out all over the globe. In New York, London, Tokyo, stores that are usually a hive of activity and filled with groceries are stripped bare. It sounds like a scene from a Hollywood disaster movie, a post-apocalyptic world with no hope. Except that reality might be closer than you realize. Because this is exactly what would happen if the critical but incredibly fragile logistics system powering major urban centers suddenly collapses. It's known as the just-in-time system, and once you understand it, your entire view of how big cities function may change forever. Most people think there are giant warehouses packed with endless supplies ready to refill empty grocery shelves at a moment's notice. The reality is completely different. Modern cities work like funnels. Food and everyday essentials flow in, get bought almost immediately, and disappear just as fast. It's an efficient system, but not a resilient one. Most major cities have only about 3 to 5 days of physical food inventory before the shelves run dry. The rest has to arrive on board heavy-duty trucks traveling hundreds of miles across the country on a daily basis. In other words, there isn't some secret warehouse waiting to save the day. Your grocery store survives because trucks keep showing up day after day without fail. The moment those trucks are delayed, disrupted, or stop altogether, the illusion of abundance disappears, and it breaks down quickly. If the just-in-time system fails, major metropolitan centers could literally run out of food in 72 hours. That's less time than it takes to get over a common cold. The moment the wheels stop turning, the countdown begins. On day 1, deliveries that were supposed to arrive fail to show. By day 2, localized panic starts to spread. Shoppers rush to their local stores and snatch up whatever supplies they can get. By day 3, everything is gone. We've been trained to believe that something like this could never happen. We trust the system. We shouldn't. Every item you buy, every piece of food you eat is all dependent on a logistics network that is entirely dependent on a constant supply of fuel. Without the fuel, the food stops moving. That's when people look for a backup, a fail-safe, an emergency system that's been put in place by the government to kick in and save the day. And there is, but unfortunately, it's already been raided. The U.S. government wasn't blind to the risks of the logistics system. It's realized that if there ever was some sort of global oil crisis or fuel shortage, transportation networks could break down and millions of Americans would be at risk of starvation. So it set up a safety net, the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or SPR. It acts as a buffer against a fuel supply crisis, ensuring that there's enough emergency petroleum to keep vehicles moving and transport networks operational. Other countries have similar strategic reserves, but the U.S. has always been one of the biggest. At full capacity, it can hold 714 million barrels, stored deep inside gigantic underground salt caverns along the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana. Now those caverns are nowhere near full. They're not even half full. As of late June 2026, the U.S. SPR held barely 330 million barrels, the lowest level in more than 40 years. You have to go all the way back to 1983 to find the reserve this depleted. For decades, the government steadily built this emergency buffer, stockpiling hundreds of millions of barrels. Then almost overnight, a huge chunk of it was gone. In early March, the government authorized the release of 172 million barrels. This was a direct response to the war in Iran, which had led to skyrocketing oil prices after the Iranian military effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz. 20% of the world's oil supply came to a dramatic halt. This was the sort of situation that the SPR was made for. The massive emergency release managed to provide some level of short-term relief to global energy markets, but the biggest issue isn't how quickly the reserve was depleted, but how slow it is to fill back up. The physics and economics involved with replenishing such a vast reserve are more complicated than opening valves to empty it. Bureaucrats are trying to buy back crude oil and pump it back into the Gulf Coast salt caverns, but they're not doing it fast enough. The current refill rate is approximately 10 times slower than the million-barrel-a-day drawdown rate witnessed in 2022. It's like having one person draining a lake using a fire hose while someone else tries to refill it with a tiny bucket. The numbers don't work. If this pace continues, it could take years to bring the SPR back up anywhere close to its maximum capacity. That doesn't mean that the U.S. has run out of oil or lost its crisis buffer entirely, but that buffer is significantly thinner and weaker than it was just a few years ago. That means the margin of error is far smaller than it has been in decades, because the safety net is riddled with holes. We don't have to guess or estimate what happens next. We've already seen this exact same scenario play out before. In 2022, Sri Lanka experienced a sharp, violent collapse that brought the entire nation to its knees. When the country's usable foreign exchange reserves dropped to near zero levels, it effectively found itself unable to service its $58.7 billion external debt. As a result, it defaulted on its debt payments for the first time in history. To make matters worse, the Sri Lankan government was no longer able to afford essential imports, including food, fuel, medicine, and fertilizer. This led to nationwide shortages of vital resources. Literally overnight, shipments of petroleum and other products and materials stopped. The nation's distribution network collapsed almost instantly. Without fuel, it was no longer possible to move goods from place to place. Food rotted in the fields since there were no trucks around to transport it to markets and grocery stores. The absence of fertilizer also meant that agricultural yields began to drop. People were forced to spend hours or even days waiting in miles-long queues to buy what little petrol remained. They were also dealing with the daily rolling blackouts that lasted up to 13 hours at a time because there wasn't enough fuel for the country's power plants. Schools closed down, hospitals postponed treatments and surgeries. The cost of simple staple items skyrocketed. By September 2022, year-on-year food inflation had reached an eye-watering 94.9%. The cost of a basic meal effectively doubled in a single year. The people of Sri Lanka had to deal with the cost of sustenance and survival rising faster than a hyperinflating currency. And it's not as though their wages were rising too. People were earning the same amount or even less than before, but somehow had to stretch their budgets twice as far. Over 6 million Sri Lankans fell into food insecurity, unsure when or where their next meal would come. More than 60% of households resorted to coping strategies, like skipping meals or eating smaller portions to get by. This is why a fuel crisis quickly becomes a food crisis. Sri Lanka provided the perfect example of what happens to your wallet when the fuel stops flowing. When a country runs out of fuel, it also runs out of food. Whatever food that's left over becomes a luxury asset with a far higher price. You might think that Sri Lanka was a one-off, an anomaly, an isolated occurrence of economic mismanagement in a developing nation. Something like this wouldn't happen in the Western world. You would be wrong. The same systemic vulnerabilities that caused the Sri Lankan crisis also exist in the US, the UK, and other nations, regardless of their status or economic standing. The idea that richer countries can reduce their risk by transitioning toward a stronger and smarter system is fundamentally flawed. We're constantly told that new technology is about to solve our biggest problems, that the next breakthrough will make our lives easier, safer, and less vulnerable to crises. Like electric vehicles, they're supposed to be the solution to our dependence on oil. Every year, there are more EVs in driveways, more electric SUVs on the highway, and more headlines predicting the end of the gas-powered car. The age of oil is ending. This is a myth, and the data proves it. Yes, global sales of electric vehicles are rising and even breaking records in many countries. Yes, governments are setting out plans to phase out vehicles with internal combustion engines and offer incentives so people buy EVs. But as of June 2026, electric vehicles make up just 5% of the global passenger fleet and almost 0% of the heavy-duty maritime and aviation sectors. In other words, while there are more EVs on the roads today, the majority are used by families for their morning commutes and shopping trips. Very few of them are being used in the sectors that sustain modern society: the trucks, the planes, and the ships that move the goods from point A to point B are almost exclusively dependent on petroleum-based fuels. It's going to stay that way for the foreseeable future. Around 80% of all global trade is transported by a vast maritime fleet that is, in effect, the lifeblood of the 21st century civilization. And 99% of that fleet needs oil to move a single mile. Cargo ships need petroleum-based fuels like heavy fuel oil or HFO and marine gas oil (MGO) in enormous quantities. The idea of suddenly switching them over to electric energy is a fantasy. There's no battery technology in existence today that is big enough or strong enough to allow these giants to make their transoceanic voyages. The same limitations apply in the air. Freight planes that move high-value or time-sensitive supplies like pharmaceuticals churn through huge amounts of petroleum-based fuels. There is no electric fleet just waiting to replace them. When you understand this, the true danger of a major global fuel crisis becomes even clearer to see. A total oil depletion is, in effect, a delete button for the global economy as we know it. If the oil stops flowing, everything stops moving. The rising popularity of EVs has no influence on that. That means the logistics systems we depend on have to compete for a shrinking pool of oil. As that competition intensifies, the cost of energy is set to reach an unprecedented breaking point. Energy analysts and financial experts like Goldman Sachs often talk about the demand destruction threshold. There comes a point at which the cost of a commodity is simply too high for consumers to absorb, so they dramatically and permanently adjust their behavior to reduce their consumption of that commodity. At that point, economic activity invariably begins to decline. Purchases are put off, travel is reduced, and investment slows down. Research and consultancy firm Wood Mackenzie believes that the demand destruction threshold for oil is between $125 and $150 a barrel. Once we enter that range, everything changes. That's because the actual energy cost required to physically move a product across an ocean, along a rail line, or down a highway exceeds the profit margin of the product itself. Imagine a product making its way through the global supply chain. It has to be manufactured, packaged, stored, and shipped across the world. It's then trucked to a warehouse, delivered to a store, and sold to you. Every step costs money. As long as fuel stays reasonably cheap, the numbers work and everyone makes a profit. But when fuel prices spike, transportation becomes more expensive. If it costs more to move a container of goods than the goods themselves are worth, shipping them simply stops making sense. Sure, companies can raise prices, but only to a point. Eventually, customers stop buying, sales dry up, and products stop moving. That's when the economic engine begins to stall. Not because the world ran out of products, but because it became too expensive to move them. This phenomenon doesn't stop there. It ripples outward across society, impacting the middle and working classes the most. As long as oil sustains a price within or above the $125 to $150 range, global GDP growth contracts. And all of a sudden, basic goods that were once cheap and accessible feel like luxury purchases. Families are forced to do mental arithmetic in the grocery store to work out what they can and can't afford. Job stability takes a hit too. As energy costs soar and consume larger parts of corporate revenues, even large and established brands are forced to scale down their operations and lay off workers. Within what feels like the blink of an eye, the average consumer is stuck between a rock of rising costs and a hard place of income insecurity. All of the comforts and conveniences of their modern lifestyle are torn away. The solid foundations of the system they grew to rely on are replaced by increasingly shaky ground. And when we think about this scenario, one obvious question emerges. Why doesn't the U.S. just use its own oil? Honestly, there's no way that would work. The U.S. is often hailed as a colossus of the energy sector, with domestic production rates and export levels reaching record highs in recent years. It's easy to assume that the oil fields of Texas and New Mexico should provide more than enough fuel to insulate the domestic market, even in cases of global shortages. Except that is not true. If you only read the headlines, you would think America has energy independence, record oil production, a booming fracking industry, no more relying on the rest of the world to keep the economy running. The reality is far more complicated. Despite producing record amounts of oil, the United States still imports huge volumes of heavy crude every single day. Sounds like a contradiction until you look at how America's oil infrastructure actually works. Not all crude oil is the same. Think of it as a spectrum. At one end is heavy crude, thick, sticky, and packed with impurities. Turning it into fuels, like gasoline and diesel, requires large, complex refineries. At the other end is light crude, which is much thinner and easier to process. These aren't just different grades of the same product. They behave differently, require different refining processes, and can't always be used interchangeably. This is where the problem comes in. The multi-billion-dollar refinery industry in the U.S. was engineered and optimized to deal with heavy, sour crude. It made sense at the time, as the global energy market was highly reliant on imports of this type of oil from places like the Middle East and Latin America. These days, however, America's fracking revolution produces enormous quantities of light, sweet crude from shale formations. But the infrastructure wasn't built for that. Trying to refine light, sweet crude in facilities designed for heavy, sour is like pouring unleaded gasoline into a diesel engine and expecting it to work just as well. It won't. The fuel and the facilities are entirely mismatched. Because of this, the U.S. is stuck. It has to keep exporting millions of barrels of its domestic light sweet oil every day to markets around the world. Meanwhile, it also has to import millions more barrels of heavy sour from its international partners just to keep its own pumps up and running in the first place. In other words, the fracking boom didn't provide any sort of energy independence. It just made the existing dependency even more complicated. The oil companies at the top of the food chain know this. They can see their limitations in the infrastructure. They can see the problems this causes. So what are they actually doing about it? People picture these big oil brands as desperate to preserve the age of petroleum at any cost. They refuse to accept the world is moving toward cleaner, more sustainable sources of energy. And there is some truth in that. The oil firms are money hungry. They are desperately attempting to squeeze out every last drop of profit they can get. But it's not because they want to stop the transition or think that they can keep selling oil indefinitely. They know their days are numbered. That's why they're planning their exit strategies. Just follow the money. Major firms like Shell and BP are funding carbon capture projects, building alternative energy infrastructure, and positioning themselves for what comes next. Money that once went to searching for new oil fields and expanding drilling capacity is being redirected into laying the groundwork for the next energy system. They're not doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. This is not some altruistic attempt to atone for the errors of the past and play a part in saving the planet. It's a way for these same companies that have dominated the energy sector for decades to maintain their monopoly as long as they possibly can. They realize that the current petroleum-dependent system is flawed, unsustainable, and screaming toward a brick wall. They know that the demand-destruction threshold will eventually be crossed, and there will be no going back from there. At that point, oil will become either physically or economically unextractable, or both. Consequently, oil giants should become obsolete. But if they buy enough of the next-generation infrastructure early, they can effectively lock in a system where we still depend on the same major corporations, just in a different form. That's the emerging geopolitical reality. Oil companies help to build a world where modern societies run on thin margins, where we rely on small buffers and just days of food and fuel in the reserve. Now, as those safety nets continue to erode and inventories sit at multi-decade lows, the same industry players are repositioning themselves for what comes next, not by leaving the system, but by owning it. But while everyone is focused on the fuel crisis, there's another indicator that we might be at an economic tipping point. We explain it all in It's Not Oil You Should Be Watching, It's Japan. Or click on this video.